Welcome students to our first information video. This video is about chapter 4, which is about enlightenment and revolutions. This video is about paragraph 1. Today we will talk about Louis XIV, who was an absolute ruler. But before we do this, you'll need some information about the French Revolution. You can always read the introduction of chapter 4. So if you don't know anything about the French Revolution, do that. But I will also give you some extra information in this video. It's the year 1789, and Europe has gone through an endless number of wars. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and farms were doing pretty badly. War is bad for agriculture. The Netherlands just came out of a war against Spain and wanted to have more freedom for the provinces. The other countries still have a monarchy, and one country has emerged as a hero from all the overseas revolutions. And that country is France. The reason is that they supported the 13 colonies of America that wanted to be free from the United Kingdom. So they kind of helped the United States to become a country. France stood up for liberty, democracy, and fraternity. In Dutch, vrijheid, gelijkheid, en broederschap. But only in North America, so not in France itself. At home, it remained an absolute monarchy. So an absolute monarchy means a monarchy where the king has all the power. And the country was also virtually bankrupt from all the war. So in 1789, France, the strongest and most popular country on the continent, so on the European continent, was in a crisis. The monarchy in France was called the Ancient Regime, which means the old government in France before the French Revolution started. France had a class society. This means that the society is divided into three social layers. The first social layer is the clergy. The second layer is the nobility, and the third layer is the rest. So the farmers, the doctors, doesn't matter what profession you had, you belong to the third layer. The first two layers made up about 3 to 5% of the population, and the third layer was about 95% of the population. And that 95% had to pay for all the taxes that the first two layers used to come around and make sure that they have a living. So imagine that only about 5% of the population were the ones that could control the country, but they don't have to pay any taxes at all. And the 95%, they have to pay everything, but they don't have anything to say in that country. You can imagine that they were not happy. Louis XIV became the king of France when he was only 6 years old. His mother ruled for him. She was advised by her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. He advised her on all matters of the state. The country was fighting a very expensive war with Spain, and the country was running out of money. The minister of France wanted to raise taxes to be able to pay for the war, but the government said no. Riots broke out. Mazarin was able to calm the rebels down and regain power. When Louis turned 15, he was crowned king. He decided to rule by himself, so he became an absolute monarch. That means that he made all the decisions and he didn't want a government to help him or any ministers. From now on, Louis was afraid that the high-ranked nobles would rebel against him. Louis XIV was fully convinced that the high-ranked nobles were not to be trusted. He left Paris and had a new palace built in the village of Versailles. There he organized large feasts, hunting parties, and official gatherings where all the nobles had to be at. The palace and all the parties were very expensive, and he paid for this by using the taxes, so raising the taxes. So he would make the people of the country pay for his parties and his palace. He made the nobles live with him at the palace so he could keep an eye on them. He would give the nobles little tasks. For example, it was seen as a huge honor to be allowed to be present when the king awoke and got out of bed in the morning. The nobles could even help him dress, so they would give him his shirt, his pants, his shoes, his socks, and they saw that as a huge honor. He made people address him as the Sun King. He had all of his power. In the year 1685, the king declared the Edict of Nantes invalid. This document had put an end to the wars against religion in France. It had given the French Protestants, called Huguenots, the Hugenoten, freedom to practice their religion. The king Louis had all the power in France, and no one could tell him no. France now had a single king who laid down the laws for his people and allowed only one religion, Catholicism. Louis believed that he got all his power from God and could not therefore be held accountable for his own actions by any earthly authority such as a parliament. This is called droit divin, or in English, divine right, or in Dutch, het goddelijk recht. So he could do no wrong because God had given him his power, and no one on earth could take that away. So if you would revolt against the king, you would also revolt against God. Louis was an absolute monarch. This meant he could decide on his own if he wanted to wage wars, and he waged a lot of costly wars. For example, against Spain, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire. So no one could tell the king no. He was picked by God, got all of his power from God, and he was the only one that made any of the decisions. For 54 years, Louis reigned by himself over France. He had taken away power from the nobility, and he had modernized the economy. But there was also a major downside to his absolute rule. Ordinary people had to pay for his wars and his lifestyles. The taxes became higher, and the French people were unhappy.